our next story takes us to a country called Aram. The army of this country was commanded by a man named Naaman. He was greatly respected by the king of Aram. However, he had a serious problem, as we can read in 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 1. Now Naaman was a commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. No doubt Naaman would have been to every doctor in the land, but to no avail. All the treatments he had received up till then had possibly only made the situation worse rather than better. What was he to do? It did look like the situation was totally hopeless. But then God stepped in and provided help. However, the help he provided came in a way that Naaman would have never expected. Let's read 2 Kings chapter 5 verses 2 and 3. Now bands of Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." I am very worried about my master Naaman, for he is very ill with leprosy. He's been to every doctor in the land. He's tried every potion that has been offered to him, but he's only gotten worse rather than better. I wish I could help him, but I am only a young servant girl. So, what can I do for him? I was not always a servant girl. In fact, I am not from this nation. I am from the nation Israel, where I lived with my family, with my mother and father and brothers and sisters. And then one day, soldiers from the nation Aram came to our town. I tried to hide from them, but they found me. And they took me to their nation. That is why I am here. Of course, I miss my family very much. And I used to cry every night before going to sleep. I don't do that anymore. But I still ask God if one day He would bring me back to my family. Yet I sense that God is with me, even in Aram, because He has provided me with a good and kind master. But then my master is so ill. So he is getting very depressed, and so is his wife. I actually do know someone who can help him. Maybe I should speak to my mistress and ask her to speak to her husband. Perhaps she can persuade him to go to Samaria, for that is where the prophet Elisha lives, and he surely can heal my master. Naaman was quite reluctant to take the advice of a young servant girl in his household. However, he knew that he was in a desperate situation, for so far no one else had been able to cure him of his leprosy. So he began to make preparations for his trip to Samaria. I might be a mighty soldier, but I am in dire straits, and I know it, for I'm a very sick man. That is why I decided to listen to the advice of this young servant girl in my household. Normally speaking, I would not ever bother to listen to her advice, for what advice could she give me? After all, I am the commander of the army of Aram, and I'm in high respect with everyone in the land, including the king. But then these are not normal days. So I decided to listen to her advice and go to the prophet in Samaria. So I went to the king, asked him for some time off, and he was very pleased to give it to me. He even wrote a letter for me to give to the king of Israel. So tomorrow I will set off for my journey to go to the king of Israel and present the letter to him. When the king of Israel received the letter, he was very upset, for he knew he would not be able to cure Naaman of his leprosy. Thankfully, the prophet Elisha heard of the king's predicament and sent him a message telling him to send Naaman to him. So Naaman traveled to the house of the prophet. Once he arrived, the prophet sent his servant to him, as we can read in 2 Kings 5 verse 10. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." I was furious when I received that message. Did the prophet not know who I am, that I am the commander of the army of Aram, and that I am very well respected in my nation, including the king? How dare he just send his servant with a message? He should have come out of the house himself and do his own magic to bring me healing. On top of that, the servant told me to wash in the river Jordan. If I have to wash in a river, I might as well go back home and wash in one of the rivers home. For the rivers home are much better than the river Jordan. Moreover, I was told to dip in the river not just 1 time, but to dip into the river 7 times. How ridiculous! I was ready to go back home. But then my servants pleaded with me and said to me, "Please, Father, it is not too difficult to do." So for their sake, we set off for the river Jordan. And I went into the water, and I dipped into the water for the first time. I expected a change, but there was no change. I dipped into the water a second time. I came up out, still no change. I dipped into the water the 3rd time, still no change. I was ready to give up and tell my servants, "This prophet is a false prophet. He has no power to change things." But for their sake, I did not say anything, and I dipped into the water a 4th time. By this time, I no longer expected to see any change. And I was right, for I was still as leprous as ever after I came out of the water for the 4th time. I did really want to give up, but my servants pleaded with me and said, "Please, Father, only 3 more times." So for their sake, I dipped into the water a 5th time. No change. A 6th time. No change. A 7th time. That is when the miracle happens. For when I came up out of the water after the 7th time, and I looked at my skin was as clean and beautiful and smooth as that of a young boy. Then I knew that the prophet was a true prophet, and that his God is the true God. So I went back to the house of the prophet, And that is when I spoke with him. And I thanked him. I had no words, in fact, to thank him for what had happened. But there's one thing I told him. I told him that from this moment on, I will no longer worship the false god of my nation, but will worship the God of Israel. For he has proven to be the true God. And so Naaman made his way back home, where no doubt his wife, and in fact his whole household, including the young servant girl, would have been anxiously waiting for him. I have been praying for my master every day since he left for Samaria, that my God would take care of him and would heal him. And every day I would look out of the window to see if he had returned, even though I knew he could not have returned as yet. But then yesterday he came back. And when I saw him, I knew that my God had answered my prayers, for my master's skin looked beautifully smooth. I am even more excited because my master has now told us that we are no longer going to worship his God, but my God, the God of Israel. Isn't that wonderful? It seems this story is primarily about two people, Naaman, the soldier of Aram, and Elisha the prophet. However, this story is very much too about a young servant girl from Israel. Because without her, Naaman would not have known about the prophet, and he would therefore not have received his healing. So this young girl has a very important role to play in this story. Let's now look at this story from a heavenly perspective. For God had his eye on this young girl, as we know from 2 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 9a. For the eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. She may have been a nobody in the eyes of the world, but God delights in choosing the weak, as we can read in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 to 29. Brothers, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world and the despised things, and the things that are not, to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. And he had chosen the plans for her life, as we know from Ephesians 2:10. For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. So God chose the place where she was to live, when she was to live there, and the family she was to be part of. He even allowed her to be abducted. But the abduction took place by a specific people selected by him, who took her back to a nation selected by him, where she came to live in a home selected by him. He allowed the master of the household to become ill, and used this young girl as his tool to bring healing and restoration to this man. In fact, God used this young girl to bring salvation to this household. For we have learned that this man, after he received his healing, decided to worship the God of Israel instead of the God of his nation. No doubt he will have introduced the God of Israel to his whole household. The Apostle Paul explains these principles in Romans 8, verse 28. For we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Therefore, if God can use a young girl from Israel, whose name we do not even know, but whose name was known by God, then we can believe that God can and wants to use us too. We may not be known by the world, but we will be known by God by name. And that is what really matters. So know that God is the one who has chosen each one of us to be born in the place where we were born, when we were to be born there, and chose the family we were to be born into. And He has a plan and a purpose for each one of us, because He knows us and loves us. So we should allow God to use us, just as He chose to use this young girl. Moreover, following God's plan and purpose will bring us a satisfaction beyond what we may have ever known.